I am Kate Hamlin, a former resident of Westford who was associated with the place either as a permanent resident or annual visitor for many years. I have been asked by an acquaintance whose childhood and youth were also passed in Westford and who has retained the same affection for the town and its interests that I have retained, to recall for the present generation and for those to follow reminiscences of my childhood and to refer to some of the changes that have taken place since then.
I am Fred Fisher, and I too have been asked to give from my recollections a list of householders in Westford Center. By way of introduction, I would say that I was born October 9th, 1855, in the house next occupied by my brother Alec Fisher, and lived there until September 1877, when I left home to enter the freshman class at Bowdoin College. I will not vouch for the accuracy of the given names which I use, though they are probably correct.
Welcome to Westford. I am Ellen Harde, a current resident of Westford who loves this town and its history. In the next 45 minutes, I will be walking with you and Kate Hamlin and Fred Fisher, who you have just met, on a tour of Westford Center as it was a century and a half ago, prior to the Civil War. They will share with you some fascinating stories. Kate Hamlin was born in Westford in 1847. When she was 90, Kate wrote down her memories of Westford as she knew it as a little girl. Fred, 8 years younger than Kate, wrote his reminiscences about the same time. Those remembrances are what they will share with you as we walk. Before we get started, I have a few suggestions. Open your map, which shows our route, and get yourself oriented. You can stop this recording at any time. If you miss anything or want to hear it again, just go back a bit and re-listen. I will give you directions for when to stop and when to move on. We will be moving at a comfortable walking pace, the old speed limit for carriages. You might like to imagine yourself in one. Sometimes I will talk to you while you are walking, and at other times I will suggest that you stop walking. Just follow my directions and you will be fine. Please do remember that the houses we will be passing by today are still homes as they were in Kate and Fred's day. Please respect the owner's privacy. You will note as we discuss these homes that names such as Hamlin, Fletcher, Abbott, Fisher, Hildreth, and Wright appear over and over again. Links between many of these families are significant. Westford is a community with a wonderful past, a community that continues to grow today with generations now joining those of old. Now, we're ready to go. Walk out of the Westford Museum, turn right, and walk to the building next door. This is the starting point for our tour. Stop the tape now until you get there, and when you're ready, start it up again. This is Westford Center, and around you are many historical homes that are as much as they were over a century ago.
In the 1860s, many of the residents of Westford Center were retired from active business and were in comfortable circumstances. Their dwelling houses were shut off from the street by walls and fences.
If I had an airplane in 1852 and if the plane were 1,000 feet above the common, the streets or roads, then as now, extended like the spokes of a wheel, north, south, east, and west. In the early history of Westford, only one church stood in the village. Not dignified by the name church, for that would have been too suggestive of the religious tyranny of England, from which the Puritans had fled. Instead, it was the meeting house, and was used not only for religious services, but also for secular meetings. Under William Channing and other liberal and advanced thinkers, a split occurred among the members of the congregation in the 1820s. The meeting house, the white steeple building across Westford Common, remained with the advanced or liberal members, and the conservatives left the meeting house and built the Orthodox Church, now standing in front of you on its original site by the southeast angle of the Common. Later, the term Orthodox was gradually dropped and replaced by Congregational. In the front of the auditorium and almost touching the ceiling was a gallery where the choir sat. This gallery faced the pulpit, and during the singing of the last hymn at the close of the afternoon session, the weary audience rose and, turning their backs on the minister, faced the singers. A special feature of the service always interested me. If a member of a family of church members had died, on the Sunday following the funeral, the family was publicly prayed for. The custom was old and, for aught I know, is still continued. John Greenleaf Whittier, in his poem, Mary Garvin, referred to this custom. One instance stands out in my memory. A young boy died, the only son in a family where there were 3 daughters. On the following Sunday, before the sermon, the pastor announced, Mr. and Mrs. So-and-so, with their daughters, desire the prayers of this congregation that the death of their son and brother may be sanctified to them for their spiritual good. The family then stood while the pastor gave voice to a long and earnest prayer. I have a suspicion that some went to church that morning, chiefly to witness the ceremony and to see how the family would take it. I wonder if the custom of tolling the bell on the death of a resident of the town is still continued in Westford.
Sadly, Kate, the custom of tolling the bell is not still continued. The building Kate just told you about was originally organized as the Union Society in 1828, and the church was built in 1829. The Congregational Church and the First Parish across the Common came back together in 1955, and this building, where Sunday school met and church suppers were held, became their parish hall. It was sold to the Westford Historical Society in 1999 and is now the Parish Center for the Arts. Proceed past this Parish Center down Lincoln Street. The house, which is now Conley Insurance at number 7 Lincoln Street, was built by John B. Fletcher as his general store when Kate was 6 years old. The store was carried on there by 3 generations of the Fletcher family. All 3 Fletchers also served as postmaster in this building, if the Democrats were in the White House. During Republican administrations, the post office was at the Wright and Fletcher store across the Common on Main Street. Alterations have taken place in the old store. The door was moved from the center of the building to the corner, and a dwelling was added to the left side of the building. Continue down Lincoln Street to number 4, which was also built by John B. Fletcher, this built in 1850, as his home. Beyond the John B. Fletcher house, where the fire station now sits, was the home of Dr. Benjamin Osgood. The granite foundation of the Osgood barn, now covered with trees, stands between number 4 Lincoln Street and the fire station. Here is Kate to tell you about Dr. Osgood, and as you listen, continue to walk past the town hall and then stop at the second house past this town hall, number 59 Main Street.
Beyond the house of John B. Fletcher and a few rods away was the large colonial house of Dr. Benjamin Osgood. What a dear old doctor he was. In his earliest practice, he made his rounds on horseback, carrying his medicines in his saddlebags. When he became too old for that method of travel, he used a 2-wheeled gig. This consisted of an armchair set on an axle with springs. He continued to carry his remedies in the saddlebags. I think the saddlebags are now in the Library Museum. I remember standing at his knee while he measured out his powders on the end of his pocket knife and carefully wrapped them in papers. In my presence, also, he rolled his pills. I wondered what they were made of. Pink root and senna seemed to be his universal remedies, for no matter what the ailment, those words were always in the direction to my mother. Dr. Osgood stood high among the physicians of those days. But what changes in medicine and surgery have taken place since then? Before the days of the discovery of ether, a brother of my grandfather, living in Maine, had an infected leg. To save his life, amputation became necessary. And the question was a most serious one. When the physicians were ready, the man, who was not a drinking man, was plied with liquor until he became unconscious and dead drunk. The case was considered so serious that prayer meetings were held in his and the neighboring villages during the operation. A case of this kind makes us realize the wonderful blessings that ether and other anesthetics have brought to thousands of sufferers. I hope all have seen the beautiful monument on Boston Common are in the public gardens, which commemorates the discovery of ether. Of Dr. Osgood's family during my last years in Westford, there remained only the widow, one son, and a daughter. The principal features of the interior of the house were the wide beams protruding from the ceiling midway of the rooms, and the posts in the corners. The most interesting piece of furniture was a cabinet standing in the parlor, filled with a complete set of Lowenstoff china, a rare possession. The house was probably the only one in the village which had an ancient knocker on its front door instead of the modern bell.
Dr. Osgood was our family physician, too, and I remember one visit that he made to our home. He probably died before I was 10 years of age, about 1865. The land for the town hall was taken by right of eminent domain out of their home place. It cost $8,000 to build that town hall in 1870.
Fred, you remember well. Dr. Benjamin Osgood died in 1863. The Osgood house and barn were torn down in 1971 so that the fire and police stations could be built. Now, on to number 59 Main Street.
Next was the home of Mr. and Mrs. Proctor. Their front yard was always most attractive in summer because of its tulips and pansies.
I remember him as Deacon Proctor. Like most of the residents of Westford Center, he was retired from active business. He set out and carefully nurtured the large shade trees which lined that side of the street.
Continue now along Main Street. You will pass a beautiful 1893 home and then Rodenbush Community Center, built in 1897 as the second Westford Academy. But in Kate and Fred's childhood, neither building was here. Stay on Main Street at the right fork in the road, pass the Frost School and the house beyond it, and then stop at the top of Leland Road. Please stop the tape until you reach the beginning of Leland Road. Number 1 Leland Road on your right was built by David Whitney in 1846. On your map, it is the Spalding House for the brothers Elbridge and Asa Spalding, who lived here by 1875.
As one continued on his way and followed the road to the right, he would see no house on the same side until he came to that now occupied by Oscar Spalding. When I was a child, the sons of David Whitney had left home and gone into business, but 2 daughters remained. Neighbors and lifelong friends of the Whitneys were the Lelands, who lived but a stone's throw away.
Look now across Leland Road to the Leland House that is on the V of Leland Road in Main Street. The house in number 4 Leland Road was built in 1826 by Ira Leland.
Ira Leland was my uncle. He had 2 daughters, one of whom was a great friend of my mother's. The other daughter married Hiram Whitney, who after his death gave the town the Whitney Playground.
To Mrs. Whitney, the young people should be eternally grateful because of the playground she willed them. Over the Leland lawn roamed the one peacock of the town and a multitude of guinea hens, and the air was alive with their cries.
You passed by the Whitney Playground. It is between the Rodenbush Community Center and the Frost School. The dedication was in May of 1911. We won't go any further down Main Street because there are no sidewalks. Stay here and listen while Kate tells us what is beyond this point.
If we had crossed the lawn from the Leland home, we should have come to the old Lowell Road and would have gone down the hill to the Snow burying ground, now the Fairview Cemetery. From that point we would turn, cross the road, and soon come to a collection of cottages often called New Jerusalem, because most of the dwellers belonged to the sect of Millerites. They believed that the end of the world was at hand and that Christ would once again appear on earth.
You might like to check out Fairview Cemetery in your car later on. Kate is buried there. Turn back up Main Street now, stay on the same side of the street, and look across the street to number 78, the greenhouse with a magnificent beech tree overhanging the street, marked as T. Fletcher on your map.
This house was occupied by Mrs. Tufts, who had a son Eben and 1 or more daughters. He even was given credit for all the deviltry done in the village, usually with justice. He was a skilled mechanic and had a small shop still standing. It was equipped with a metal and a woodwork lathe. He was also a hunter and a carpenter. As a boy, I used to enjoy visiting the shop and being allowed to use his firearms.
Proceed to the Red House at number 76 Main Street.
The only magazine contributor of the village was Miss Amanda Hale. Her stories were mostly published in the Waverley magazine. She lived in a rather large house with her mother, and it is probable their income was mostly from the daughter's writings. As Mrs. Hale was a recluse who apparently never went out and was seen only occasionally in her garden, children did not think very highly of her and thought she must be rather disagreeable. I was told, however, that she was far from that, a woman of some cultivation who suggested many of the plots which her daughter used.
I remember the Hale house as being occupied by Reverend George Matthias Rice, minister of the Unitarian Church, later by a family from Lowell with a large flock of children, and later still by Marcellus H. Fletcher.
The next house is number 72 Main Street, a house that has had many owners over the years.
This was a house occupied by Greenleaf Drew. He had two sons, George and Frank. George was an active, energetic young man who died of consumption in early life. Frank Drew owns and occupies the farm of my grandfather, Eli Tower. Mrs. Drew had a daughter, Laura Mace, by her former husband. She studied elocution and gave readings, and I think taught the subject in the Lowell schools.
Let us now cross over Main Street just before the traffic island. The corner property, now Splitview Farm, was the Greenleaf Drew house. Go right onto Depot Street to Running Fox Farm at number 3 Depot.
This house was occupied by Alvin Fisher, my father. It is now occupied by my brother Alec Fisher. I was born in this house on October 9th, 1855.
Fred's father, Alvin Fisher, and later his son Alex, were butchers and had a slaughtering business here. Now, continue down Depot Street just a few yards to the crosswalk, cross the street, and turn back toward Westford Common. Continue back on Main Street, and just past the brick Verizon building, you will see numbers 68 and 70 Main Street.
This house was occupied by Charles L. Fletcher, brother of Mrs. Eli Tower and my great-uncle on the maternal side, and also he was maternal grandfather of Herbert V. Hildreth. He was a quiet man, an excellent mechanic, and worked for years for the Sargent Company in Graniteville. There is a tradition that he solved by practical methods a problem in construction which no one of the several graduates of the Institute of Technology to whom it was submitted were able to do.
The next house is number 66 Main Street. This house is one of the landmarks of the town, a fine example of colonial architecture with brick ends and 4 beautiful fireplaces.
This house on the right was owned and occupied by Winthrop Wheeler. Between his house and the previously mentioned Fletcher house, there was a long line of purple lilac bushes, which were patronized by the school children in early summer. There were 2 or 3 horse chestnut trees in front of the house.
Reverend Winthrop Wheeler purchased this property about 1850, and it remained in the Wheeler family until 1938. Let's walk on to 62 Main Street, built in 1780 by the Nichols brothers, who occupied the house for some 50 years, and it's shown on your map as the house of C.H. Fletcher.
After the Nichols, this house was owned and occupied by preceptor Ephraim Abbott, whose portrait appears in Hodgman's Town History. He was a tall, dignified, and venerable man. After the death of Mr. and Mrs. Abbott, their 2 daughters and their son George remained there until the place was sold to Charles H. Fletcher, the son of Abijah, and is now known as the White Place. George was a graduate of Harvard College, but he lacked his father's energy. It was rumored in my younger days that he was preparing a book on synonyms.
Pass number 60 Main Street and pause at 58 Main Street, marked as Mrs. Fletcher's house on the map.
The next house on the right was occupied by Deacon Wright. I know nothing of him or his family, except that I have a few unpleasant recollections of his having disciplined me for cutting a stick to make a whistle from the Osgood property across the street.
From 1912 to 1941, the telephone exchange was located in the L of this house at number 58. Those were the days of operator-assisted calls. The operator's name was Phonesy Isles. Next is the Mansard House at 56 Main Street.
Now here was the blacksmith shop of John Langtree. The shop was set back some distance from the street, and in front of it he always maintained an attractive flower garden. I think there was no rival to it unless it was the one kept by Reverend Leonard Luce.
Now the buildings that Fred describes next were at the site of the little house at 54 Main Street. The buildings that Fred knew have since been destroyed, one by fire and the other torn down.
Now the next buildings were the house and store of Samuel Wiley. He was a generous, high-strung man who in his younger days made bricks in the south part of the town on what was known as Brick Kiln Hill, just north of Parker Village. In his later years he ran the store which heretofore had been occupied by tenants. The first storekeeper I recall was Peter Swallow.
Walk on to the J.V. Fletcher Library. The Wright and Bancroft House formerly stood on the site of the library.
Now returning to the north end of the common, the house next beyond Wiley's store, a double tenement building, was occupied and probably owned by Jacob Wright. He had a small cobbler's shop located between his house and the store. One of his legs had been amputated. Now the younger people of the town looked upon him with awe because we were told of the suffering he bore when his leg was amputated, which was before anesthesia. He was a generous, kindly man. I frequented his shop as I did most of the places in the neighborhood, and I have very pleasant recollections of him. He had two sons, one of whom, Edward, I think, lost his life at the time the house was burned some years ago.
The Wright and Bancroft House fire, which Fred remembers, was on December 5th of 1891. In 1894, the land upon which the Wright House had stood was purchased by the town of Westford to build the library. An oil painting of the Wright House still hangs in the J.V. Fletcher Library. Now, on to the white church next door.
This is the Unitarian Church.
Remember, in the early history of Westford, this was the only church in the village. It was called the Meeting House and was used not only for religious services but for secular meetings. It was under William Channing and other liberal and advanced thinkers that the split occurred among the members of the congregation in the 1820s. This building remained with the advanced or liberal members, and the conservatives left the Meeting House and built the Orthodox Church, now standing across Westford Common.
Sometime after the Civil War, the Unitarian Church was remodeled and partially turned around under the administration of Reverend George H. Young, who, according to the town history, was ordained October 17, 1866.
It was 2 years after Reverend Young's ordination, that would be 1868, that the church was turned 90 degrees to face Main Street. Pass the church now and stop at the head of Canal Drive, and Kate will tell you about the former Butterfield Tavern which stood here.
From the west angle of the common at the right stood a large house with a piazza extending the length of its front, which faced south. In the house, which had once been one of the many taverns scattered through New England, was a small hall on the second floor front, extending the length of the house, and in that hall was the first dancing school I attended. This house was owned and occupied by David C. Butterfield. The family consisted of father, mother, 2 daughters, and a son. The older daughter's name was Mary, and that of the younger, Lydia Anna, called by all of us Lydiana. The son was Eliza, and as I remember them, they were all rather handsome. Mary had one of the first pianos in the village. I think there was also one in the Amos Haywood family, another in Mr. Sherman Fletcher's home, and I can vision myself standing entranced as Mary touched the keys and brought forth what, to me, was wonderful music. Mary Butterfield was for several terms a teacher in the village school, but this was before my school days. My first teacher was my cousin, Caroline Fletcher from Pepperell, whose mother was my father's sister.
The Butterfield Tavern burned about 1859, and soon after, John W. P. Abbott built his homestead on this site, and when that burned in 1914, Westford lost one of its most illustrious homes. Continue on Main Street until you come to a small store housing sweet peas.
The next building on the same side of the street was the store of Sherman D. Fletcher, for years the town treasurer and postmaster. In his youth he had been a page in Congress at Washington. He was a very dignified man and was one of the leading citizens of the town. His tastes were literary, and he was the author of a number of interesting articles. His daughter, Emily Frances, was a naturalist. Her collection gratefully received after her death by the Botanical Society connected with Harvard College. She left the town a fund, the income of which is to be used for lectures on nature subjects. Now his son, Sherman H. Fletcher, was a man of prominence and for a number of years captain of the Spalding Light Cavalry.
Sherman D. Fletcher was also father of Mrs. George Day. Next to the store, and very near it, was a small yellow house where lived the Herrick family. Some years later, one of the few tragedies of the town occurred. One morning, everyone was shocked to hear that Mrs. Herrick, an old lady, had risen in the night and had fallen into the well.
Walk a few steps to number 36 Main Street. This was the site of the Herrick House.
Yes, I too remember this house as being occupied by Mr. and Mrs. Herrick and their son-in-law, Mr. Dodge, and his family. Mr. Herrick used to come to the post office every day to borrow Mr. Fletcher's newspaper, whispering aloud to himself as he read it.
The Herrick House was later torn down, and the current house at 36 Main Street was moved here from across the street. Next, at number 32 Main Street, you see the beautiful home of Abiel J. Abbott, which was later lived in by his son Edward. In Kate and Fred's childhood, Westford, between the Herrick House and the corner of Graniteville Road, there were two houses. First, right next to the Herrick House, was the house of the Gross family.
In front of what is now the beautiful home of Edward Abbott, and standing close to the road, was a large, old-fashioned house owned and occupied by the Gross family. The family consisted of preceptor, he had once been principal of the academy, I believe, and Mrs. Gross and one daughter, who later married Artemus Cummings. The Cummings house stood right next door, just where the road branches off toward Graniteville, then generally called the Stone Quarry.
That farmhouse of Artemus Cummings at the corner of the road to Graniteville burned one Monday night in the winter season, probably about 1875. Mr. Cummings built a new house on the site, which was sold after his death to Abiel J. Abbott, who built his spacious residence now standing on the premises. Mr. Abbott sold the Cummings house to Henry O. Keyes, who caused it to be moved down the Graniteville Road, where it now stands at the brow of the hill on the left-hand side looking north, the last building but one on that edge of the village.
Fred, you remember the houses burning down in 1875. That's close, but Emma Day's diary tells us that Art Cummings' house burned February 27, 1872. And that edge of the village, as Fred refers to it, is 18 Graniteville Road, where that new house of Artemus Cummings still stands today. Let's stay on this side of the street where there's a sidewalk. Turn now and walk back toward the Common. Look across Main Street now at number 33 Main, the cream-colored house with a fence.
Beyond an old orchard, I saw an old house, the home of Sherman Fletcher, which later was razed, and the present house, where now live his two great-granddaughters, was built.
Yes, that's right. About opposite the Artemis Cummings place was the home of Sherman D. Fletcher.
The Sherman D. Fletcher House, now at 33 Main Street, was built in 1848 and is one of the very few old Westford homes to have been owned and occupied by the same family for over 100 years. Specializing in blackberries, raspberries, grapes, currants, and apples, they shipped nightly over the road by Westford's horse-drawn vehicles to meet their consignments to Boston's early morning markets. They also ran the general store across Main Street where Sweet Peas is now. The house was sold in 1969 after the death of Gertrude, the second of Sherman's two great-granddaughters. Walk back to Sweet Peas and look across the street to 39 Main Street.
And the next building going back on the south side of the street was a dwelling house with an iron fence in front of it, which was occupied, according to my early recollections, by Charles L. Fletcher, grandfather of Herbert V. Hildreth. Either he or Mrs. Fletcher had charge of the town library, which was next taken in hand by either Mr. or Mrs. Dodge, and later located at the Charles L. Fletcher House on Depot Street.
A few rods beyond stood the house of J.W.P. Abbott, which, after the removal of the Abbotts, was occupied for many years by the Ellen Cameron family.
The house Fred remembers was torn down in order to have 39 Main Street built, the Allen Cameron House in 1876. At the same time, the second house, which Kate remembers as belonging to J.W.P. Abbott, was moved across the street to become 36 Main Street, to the left of Sweet Peas. Walk now to Canal Drive and look back across the street to the bank, where the house of Esquire Abbott stood.
Across the garden from the J.W.P. Abbott house stood, almost on the footpath in front, a very old house, the home of Esquire Abbott, the father of J.W.P. Abbott. I remember hearing one morning that Esquire Abbott had died. He was a man greatly respected and who, in those days, was considered very wealthy. For many years his housekeeper had been Miss Rachel Blood, and to her he left a life interest in the house in which she lived for many years. She was rather an interesting character who attracted many to her apartment. She spent most of her time in one room in which was an old four-poster bedstead. The fireplace was surrounded by tiles with blue and yellow figures on them. Many times I visited her, and I can now close my eyes and see everything in the room. The wallpaper was a great attraction to me, showing a variety of landscape pictures, a fashion in wallpapers now returning. She must have been very old, for she was almost blind for many years and seldom went out. Yet, like many stay-at-homes, she managed to know most of the gossip and affairs of the village. After her death, the house was torn down, and later the modern house of John W. Abbott was built in the adjoining orchard.
I remember that house, somewhat back from the street and occupied by Rachel Blood, a domestic servant of John Abbott, father of John W.P. Abbott. I remember her as a very aged person. She did her cooking over a fireplace, but I don't remember the house being torn down, Kate. I remember on her death the house was sold to Samuel Wiley and moved to the foot of the hill on Boston Road and now belongs to Mr. John F. Sullivan.
Fred is right. The home of Esquire Abbott was moved in 1871 to 44 Boston Road, where it still stands. And in its place, a 3-story house, modestly called the Mansion, was built by John W. Abbott, grandson of Esquire Abbott. The mansion stood until 1941, when it was torn down. And in 1961, the new Westford Center post office, now the Northern Bank and Trust, was built. Note the granite post on the side of the bank. If you look at some of the older pictures of Westford in the book The New Old Houses of Westford, which is available at the museum, you will see that granite post there for both the mansion and the John W. Abbott, as well as the older house of Squire Abbott. Please cross Canal Drive to the crosswalk to Westford Common. Follow the sidewalk down Boston Road to the cast iron flower pot, once a watering trough. Look to your right, where you will see, flanked by 2 granite benches, the large granite step which marks the site of the first Westford Academy, built on this corner in 1794.
Westford Academy stood on the south side of the common.
You can see the 4 granite posts that bounded the 4 corners of the Academy land. The step was installed here in 1942 on the occasion of the 150th anniversary of the founding of Westford Academy.
This building has since been moved to the rear of the Orthodox Church and converted into a firehouse.
In 1975, Fred's firehouse was converted to the Westford Museum where your tour began. Look now down Hildreth Street to the first house on the right beyond the Academy step.
The house beyond the Academy was another of those old buildings, not unlike that of Sherman Fletcher, and a few others to be seen in various parts of town. I may have been 4 or 5 years old when this house, where my Uncle Nathan lived, was torn down and the present house built. I have a very indistinct memory of the confusion of the destruction of the old and the building of the new. At that time, the old cheerful fireplaces were being replaced by stoves, but when this house was built, Mrs. Hamlin, my Aunt Harriet, insisted on having one fireplace, not for cheer and comfort, but that she might be able to roast her Thanksgiving turkey in a tin kitchen before an open fire. This, in her estimation, was the only way in which a turkey should be roasted. So, in her bedroom, a fireplace was built. As far as I know, a fire was never lighted there, except on Thanksgiving morning.
Continue down the sidewalk along Boston Road and stop when you reach Lincoln Street. Across Boston Road is number 2 Hildreth Street, the former Fletcher Tavern, and the house where Kate Hamlin was born.
To pass now a short distance to the angle where the Littleton and Boston roads meet, there stood, and I hope still stands, my old home in which 5 generations of my family had lived, 3 of whom were born there. In days long past, the house must have witnessed many interesting scenes, and for many it was another of the many New England taverns. Before the days of the railroad, travelers arrived by stage, or more frequently on horseback. Daniel Webster is in one of his rides through the country, met and fell in love with Grace Fletcher, whom he married. She was the niece of my step-great-grandmother. Almost at our door was the old schoolhouse, consisting of 2 stories, the lower used in summer for the village school, but in winter, when many older boys were supposed to attend school, the upper story was used for the younger children under the care of a female teacher, and the lower story for the older boys and girls, taught and disciplined by men. How dreary to me those school days were. I remember once when a big snowstorm was raging, my father's hired man came and took me home on his shoulders.
Kate's old schoolhouse was no longer used as a school after 1874 and was torn down in 1961. Now turn around and face the white church.
As I turn with the common in front of me and the graceful spire of the Unitarian Church rises before me, I realize that the village has been completely circumscribed.
I hope that you have enjoyed this tour of historic Westford, and that this has piqued your interest in Westford and its historic homes. I would like to take this opportunity to invite you back to the museum for a browse through the bookstore where you will find the complete manuscripts written by Kate and Fred, as well as many other pictorial histories of Westford. Remember, I mentioned that you might want to visit Fairview Cemetery? There you will find headstones with names now familiar to you: Hamlin, Fletcher, Abbott, Fisher, Hildreth, and Wright, the previous inhabitants of these lovely homes. The cemetery is 1 mile down Main Street. To visit Fairview Cemetery, head back past the Town Hall to the Leland House, then continue down the hill on Main Street, past Whitney's Garage, and the main entrance to Fairview Cemetery is where Tadmuck Road intersects with Main Street. The older graves are at the far end of the cemetery. Thank you, Kate and Fred, for our journey with you, and my thanks to Barbara Seavey for portraying Kate and to Ralph Hinckley for being Fred Fisher.